David, last night John Podorz was here. Unfortunately, John's not here tonight to defend or explain, but you took issue with the things John said, some of which I agreed with. And I kind of agree with both of you. But if you would explain what John said, and I'm sure you'll characterize it fairly, certainly to the best of your ability, explain what John said and annotate and explain your disagreement. And I'll just say, I'm not as interested in the media as a story as many people are, including many people who are part of this community. But it's super important. And I think it's super important right now because, again, I'll repeat what I always say. Covering Donald Trump is really hard. It's harder than running against him. And I think we all, whether we're journalists or citizens, we all have to figure out what the democracy requires to cover him in the right way at a time when John and I believe the media is extraordinarily mismatched. And John and I believe Trump cares less about what the media thinks than he did 8 years ago. David.
Yeah, I had 2 points of contention with your arguments. You guys were talking about the press conference yesterday, the hour Trump press conference he did in Mar-a-Lago. And John said something to the effect of the media's taking the bait, Trump's running over them. They're talking about Greenland. Why are they asking all these questions about Greenland? And I'm sitting there watching this. I wasn't at this press conference, but I watched it twice. And I actually found the questions to be thorough, substantial, uh, smart follow-ups were had. That is not always the case. I'm not a blanket defender of the mainstream media, but I watched this presser twice, and I just didn't understand what John was saying, that Trump's railroading the media. I mean, he got asked really tough questions that elicited substantive answers on Ukraine policy, and he kept saying, Greenland, why are you taking the bait on Greenland? Donald Trump is talking about Greenland every day. The job of a reporter, if I'm their assignment editor, you follow up, you push him. There's a very smart follow up asked during this press conference that said, Mr. President, do you have a team in place for how you might acquire Greenland? And he said no. Now, that's a small detail, and you know this, Mark. You slip it in your story later to show that maybe it's not as serious. Maybe it is all bluster. Greenland's probably bluster. The Panama Canal is probably bluster. But as a reporter, that's the day's story, and you probe it and you put the context into the story that he tried this before, it didn't work, it may be a distraction. And, you know, I just think that reporters actually came off good in this instance, and that it was a good press conference for reporters. And I think Trump came off good. And it wasn't personal. He didn't call anybody nicknames. He was substantive. The reporters were substantive. So I disagreed on that point. And then the second point that I think you made and underscored about Trump not caring about the mainstream media, which, I just couldn't disagree more. He first of all, the fact that he had this press conference shows that he's back to wanting the attention of the New York Times, NBC News, ABC News. He loves it. He won the election. He doesn't need to cater to 20-year-olds who listen to 8 hours of Joe Rogan a week. The last thing he can do as a crowning legacy is to win the affirmation of the legacy, whatever you want to call it, legacy, mainstream, lamestream media. And I think it was most telling that he called on David Sanger, who is the most institutional reporter in Washington. He gave him 4 questions. He didn't give it to Breitbart. He didn't give it to OAN or Newsmax. He gave it to David Sanger. Then he went to a CBS reporter. So to me, I think I would bet that Donald Trump does 5 times the more press conferences with mainstream media outlets than he ever does a podcast. I think that was a smart campaign tactic. I think they used it well. I think it was a mistake that Kamala Harris didn't do it. It was all smart. But Trump now does not need voters anymore. He's unencumbered by voters. And I think just what you've seen, what was his first post-election interview? He didn't meet the press. A dying Sunday show that I don't even watch anymore. I think it's past its prime. But I think to him, a 78-year-old man, he wants the validation of Meet the Press. He spoke in the press conference about he still watches Fox News, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. So I just don't think Trump is ever going to not want the affirmation of the mainstream media. And I think the mainstream media will become more relevant in his second term because it will be his crowning jewel if he can get the New York Times to write a story in 2027 that, hey, we were wrong. This guy accomplished a hell of a lot.
David, here's what I think. On your first point, I think the questions were above average for the White House press corps, without a doubt. I think what John said, I think, and what I agree with is they were in some instances, but not in all, but in some instances, I think they were too uh, um, uh, reflective of Trump's point of view. That they were letting him decide what they asked about. But I agree with you; they asked about a lot of things. So I generally agree with you on that. On the second point, I hope we didn't make it seem all or nothing. Trump doesn't not care about the legacy media. As you said, no one who does meet the press in their first post-election interview can be said not to care about the legacy or the dominant media. And calling on David Sanger makes him happy because it makes him feel like a real president, Pinocchio, because David Sanger's sitting there asking him substantive questions. I think my point of view, and I won't speak for John here, although I think he and I are simpatico on this, he doesn't care in the sense that he's not going to live or die based on what they say. Of course, he wants to be crowned by them. There's no doubt that that's his preference. But if they turn on him, having tried to put him in prison for 4 years, if they turn on him, he's not going to, it's not going to make or break him the way it would have. He's not going to be anguished over it. He's not going to say to his team, we need to get the New York Times back on my side because they've written three bad stories in a row. I think he's just going to say, let's do something else because they're back to being the resistance. And that's different than 8 years ago.